You're watching the International Chopin Competition coming to you from Warsaw, Poland, and we are here in stage 3 of the competition. And in this stage, we've been hearing sonatas, we've been hearing mazurkas and free rep, but it is the sonatas that will be our main focus today. Now, when you think of Chopin, you might think of genres like nocturnes and ballades and various perfumey kinds of sounds, not this Germanic form, the sonata with its, very structured organization and multi-movement form. But Chopin did believe in the sonata, at least enough to write 3 of them during his career. And I'm here with 2 experts on different facets of the sonatas, and in particular Chopin sonatas. Cambridge University professor John Rink is here, and also Jed DISTLER, who is the official gramophone blogger of the International Chopin Competition this year. And John, let's start with you. As a member of the jury, you'll be hearing lots of these sonatas, and I actually wanted to start with a sonata that is lesser played, but actually we're hearing it twice this round, and that's the Opus 4, a student work of Chopin, his first sonata, which I confess I never actually listened all the way through to until I had been in conservatory for a decade. But can you just give us some background for this youthful composition and maybe what its virtues are, since we're often neglecting it as pianists and fans?
I mean, it's easy to dismiss that sonata as a kind of juvenile exercise dedicated to his teacher, Joseph Elsner. There's sort of heavy-handed motivic working in the first movement and all of these things. We have to remember, too, that although it was designated as Opus 4, one of Chopin's earliest published pieces, the publication was withheld by Chopin. It never appeared during his lifetime. So it is easy to dismiss the piece on the one hand, but there is an awful lot of interest in the work, perhaps more individual ideas than necessarily the sum of all of those parts. But there's some real originality in play, not least play with meter and time, as well as some of the ideas that will make their way into other later pieces, such as the concertos.
Well, you're beating around the bush. Let's talk about 5/4. I mean, as a kid writing in an unusual meter for the time. Jed, you've listened to a lot of recordings of this, and maybe you could even think, if you have any in mind, that make that particular movement, which for me is the jewel of the first sonata. Do any recordings in your mind have a particularly special slow movement, or how do you sort of
I would say, well, I think Piotrkiewicz-Błazik has a beautiful recording of it. Also, Vladimir Ashkenazy is very heartfelt, and his legato phrasing is really quite attractive. But another pianist who you really should hear in the entire sonata is the late Uruguayan pianist, Dinora Varsi. She really played this piece with great authority. And also there's an excellent recording with Nikita Mogilev in his series of the complete Chopin piano works.
And can I add our friend Martin Garcia, bronze medalist from 2021, who recently has been touring with the first sonata, and he first woke me up to the piece too. He really brings it alive. It's really fresh.
Well, I look forward to hearing that.
I absolutely recommend it.
I heard it in London some time ago when he performed, and I have to say he has a lot of fresh insight into it.
And John, it was Martin who pointed out to me that he believes, and he has a lot of conviction with this, and he's beginning to sell me on it, that Chopin might have been influenced by Schubert's Wanderer Fantasy. Now, I don't know, I believe the Wanderer Fantasy was one of Schubert's published works during his lifetime. Now, many of his works were not. And maybe it made its way to Poland. Maybe Elsner put it in front of Chopin's desk, but this bum, da da dum, da da da, the last movement of the first sonata, maybe it's just a common dactylic rhythm, but it really feels like the Wanderer. What do you think?
I think we should be cautious about pointing to direct influence, but there may be a kind of shared rhetoric. I mean, we can see this kind of thing with other pieces too, certain sorts of ideas, tropes, if you will, that get shared across pieces, across composers. So I wouldn't necessarily want to point to direct influence.
Yeah. But it's quite striking.
It is striking.
Sort of
and if I may
rhythm.
add, in the finale you have these treacherous double notes, which are cruelly exposed, and it really takes an extraordinary virtuoso to really pull this off with total conviction. And in this sense, I forgot another recording by a really marvelous pianist who I adore, Cyprian Katsaris. And we should talk about him in the other sonatas too, but his first sonata is totally delicious in that sense.
Just one thing to say that's quite interesting with respect to this early piece. There's a real challenge here because, as you said, it's a kind of Germanic form. There's a sense of architecture and weight attached to the music, but it's also early Chopin. And striking the balance between something that's weighty and architectural, but also has charm and that kind of juvenile freshness, I think this is really quite tricky for pianists. Many people opt for one versus the other, and it tends not to succeed.
Yeah, I think you're right, yeah.
Well, of course, the second and third sonatas are most popular, and they're going to be played the most often in this round. And I believe it's the second that contains within it perhaps not only the most popular piece of Chopin, but one of the most popular works of classical music to enter into popular culture, and that is the so-called March Funèbre, although
Pray for the dead, and the dead will pray for you.
I've been talking with our colleague Jeff Kahlberg, and Jeff has done some very interesting work to, well, first of all, he pointed out what we know, which is that Chopin actually withdrew this.
Right.
Could you talk, first of all, about how this is not a funeral march per se?
Well, this is a really fascinating story because in the proof copy of that slow movement, it's headed Marche Funèbre, and indeed it was published with that heading in the French first edition. But in a later impression, released not long after the initial publication, the heading has been changed to simply Marche. Now, this has been a classic gift to me as a teacher over the years, because I say to my students, what do you think is behind this? And we think that this removal of funèbre, so that it remains only March, had to come from Chopin. So what's behind it? What did Chopin have in mind? And my own explanation is that it has to do with Chopin's discretion. When it says Marche Funèbre, it is a funeral march. When it says simply march, you are invited to hear that it is a funeral march, but you are not told that it is a funeral march. And this has to do with Chopin's power of suggestion, which is so important to his aesthetic generally.
And I love this idea that it wasn't actually Beethoven's Opus 26 Sonata Funeral March that was influencing Chopin, but actually perhaps a Rossini opera, The Thieving Magpie, which has not a funeral march, but a march to the scaffold. And if you think of this slow movement from Chopin's Second Sonata as a march of the condemned, who's still alive and knows their fate, it totally transforms how we think of that particular movement.
I think it's fascinating just how often we find in Chopin hints of funeral marches. Not only the famous C minor prelude, but at the ending of the G minor ballade, after all the sound and the fury, we have in the distance a funeral march, and then these angry scales, and then the funeral march comes back, and then the angry scales, and then it all breaks down. And so Chopin uses the funeral march idea very often as a point of reference for some sort of, tragedy, sadness, decay, death, who knows?
Right, and also think about, the Opus 48 number 1 Nocturne, which is, which we've heard so much in these days, and we'll be hearing the Largo from the B minor Sonata. I mean, that has that ceremonial kind of sensibility too.
Jed, talk to us about the second sonata. I mean, not only the march, and by the way, in Chopin's letters, he never refers to it anything besides as the march. So his march, but also there's other movements here. But thinking of that particular movement and how it gives way to this avant-garde, what is it? The
wind over.
Well,
the grain
that was a
door.
later sort of thought, but didn't Chopin say something like it's just two voices gossiping or something?
Yes.
But what do you make of the history of the recorded legacy of this really unusual movement in particular?
Well, I think this sonata, especially in this movement, it really abounds in incredible recordings that are so diverse and often contradictory in approach. And in fact, 10 years ago on my radio show Between the Keys, our friend and colleague Lisa Yui and I compared 22 different recorded versions of that finale. It was really quite an extraordinary thing. And
there's different approaches. One can play it very dry. There's a tradition of playing it dry because there's no pedal indication until the very end of the work. But also we often hear pedal added to create whooshes.
Let's say we could take some performances that survive. We can take some performances from the Chopin competition, archival recordings. For instance, Maurizio Pollini's 1960 live performance, which has just been issued on LP by the Chopin Institute, by the way. He plays it, I wouldn't say so dryly, but it's very much in tempo with both hands absolutely equal. The equilibrium is extraordinary, and you can tap your foot to it. Whereas Michel Blanc in the same competition was a little bit looser, although his slower tempo allowed you to hear some of the inner counter melodies that are either stated or implicit. And then in 1980, you get to Ivo Pogorelic, who uses more pedal, but you still have that incredible unanimity between the hands and very decisive shape and great intention in how he does this. So those three alone from the competition are cases in point. I think one of the most famous is Rachmaninoff, which, how do you describe that? I mean, that's just a whirlwind, with all kinds of crazy effects and pedalings. And then you have somebody like Cyprian Katsaris on record where he uses the middle pedal a lot, and he has all these funny little accents, and he kind of changes it into kind of like an animated cartoon. And then you have Horowitz, which is kind of gnome-like. Very interesting, and he plays it very differently live versus in the studio, and ditto with Arthur Rubinstein. So, I mean, the approaches are, a millionfold.
When you get such an enigmatic work, it's going to inspire lots of different, because it's people grappling with trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And so,
now, I want to tell you, the way that this should be judged in a competition, you should have 10, 15 pianos on stage, have everybody start that movement, go on your mark, get set, go. And whoever finishes first, bong, ding, dong, ding,
well, maybe
who gets the prize.
Let's get Schlenner here, the director, and we've got a jury member. Maybe we can make that change on the spot. What do you think?
I'll speak to my jury colleagues and see whether we think this is a good idea or not.
And one of your colleagues, Juliana Avdeva, I had the chance, great fortune to interview her about her sonata performance from 2010, which won the award that year. Yeah. And she deliberately took a dry approach. She really took the score seriously. And it's so risky to do that. And I wonder how many dry performances we'll hear this year, because if you can pull that off, it can be very powerful.
Well, I think it depends a lot on what has come before in the so-called funeral march movement. And the stand-up performance for me in recent memory is that of Alexander Gagiev, who in the slow movement created a true impression of death. Although it may simply be called march in the score, this corrected score, he really made it a funeral march. So that middle section was like the cold of death, completely inert, like on the slab. And it was so moving. When the march came back, I really felt as if I was mourning someone who had died. It felt like a bereavement.
And so the scaling of the dynamics was extraordinary.
And what's important about Alex's performance that year, I think, also is that he didn't cry and sob in that middle section.
No. Absolutely not. It was death.
Yeah, it was.
And it was so frightening. I mean, the hairs were on the back of my neck, and I really was frightened by this. So I think creating that effect with the march coming back as if it is truly a funeral march, and then afterwards it did feel like the voices beyond the grave. It really felt like that.
But I think one has to bring those similar qualities to the Largo in the B minor sonata, where you have to sometimes park yourself in neutral because you have to let the music unfold on its own volition,
That's a good segue, although we didn't touch on the first two movements of the second sonata. We could take a U-turn and come back, but let's go ahead and take this portal into the third sonata through this luxuriously long nocturne. Some call it the greatest nocturne he ever wrote, the third movement. Somewhat of a bel canto scene, but also something mournful, and another one of these pieces that inspires lots of different approaches and tempi, and because, well, one can sound repetitive, one can get into the doldrums with this work, right, John?
I think so. I mean, one critical thing with this piece as a whole, I'd be interested to know Jed's view on this, knowing the recorded history so well. You mustn't play the middle section of the second movement, the scherzo movement, too slowly. It's in B major as well as C flat major, really, but it's written as B major. People often play that too slowly, and it kills the thunder of the third movement. But I think the key to playing that third movement is creating space, so that you open up this space and then you move into a different space in the middle. And the performance there that stands out in my memory, truly life-changing, was 2015 Kate Liu. whose capacity to spin musical time was extraordinary, and it absolutely, for me, came into its own in the slow movement of the B minor, where it was going somewhere, but time stopped. It was a completely different realm.
I'm getting goosebumps now that you mentioned
And but also Emil Gilels, I think, had this extraordinary control of time scale in this slow movement also.
Someone else I heard twice live in the Royal Festival was Christian Zimmermann. And this was with thousands of people. It was one of those moments you have in a huge hall where everybody feels as if they're breathing as one. It was an extraordinary experience, and it was in this slow movement both times. He played it probably very similarly, as you might expect. But it was, again, that kind of being outside the context of time and moving into a different realm, which is precisely what Chopin offers us.
And actually, this is really interesting, talking about the end of the third movement, moving into the fourth. There's a very interesting recording that I recommend viewers go look up, of course, after you finish watching the Chopin talk and the rest of the competition today. But Benno Moiseiwicz felt in such a spiritual place of refuge at the end of the third movement of the sonata that he skips the chords at the beginning of the fourth, and he goes straight into the main theme. He just couldn't bring himself to bring violence to that piece. Now, I don't recommend any contestants
Maybe
skip
No.
these crucial bars, but this is also another interpretive moment for the contestants. Do they begin the fourth movement of the third sonata by sneaking in, like we hear sometimes? Do they just come in and announce that we're there? Jed, what have you heard from this third sonata, whether it's the fourth movement in that particular approach, or just in general, great performances that culminate in a fourth movement that's really satisfying in different ways?
You know, there's so many good ones. I mean, you have to talk about the classic Dinu Lapati recording, and with all of the movements. William Capell's recording from, I think it was 1951 or somewhere around then, is incredibly worked out and scrupulously detailed. Maybe a little bit sectionalized for my taste, but it's still quite wonderful. I have always loved Claudio Arau's recording. I think that's from 1960, because he really takes the whole piece in a very large-scale, serious way, and it may not be for everyone's taste, but he's somebody who approaches decorative passages as rapid melodies, and I think that he takes his cue from Maria Callas and her approach to trills and to decorative passages and, you know, arias and like Bellini's Norma. And you hear this especially in how Arau resolves cadences and turns and so on and so forth. And so even when he's playing fast, it doesn't quite scintillate, but it is really very full-bodied, and it's something that I get a lot of inspiration from.
I find this really interesting because I think one of the key things we have to remember about this piece is it is a rondo. If you compare this movement, this fourth movement, to one of the earlier rondos, and I have in mind the Opus 5, the Rondo alla Misura, it's a very similar form, but what Chopin does in that piece is to have a thematic section, a transition, a thematic section, a transition, and so forth, with a kind of final flourish. What he does in the case of the B minor fourth movement is to juxtapose sections head on. There's an abutment that is absolutely violent, but it still flows. And that, from the standpoint of architecture, is interesting, but just to add one final point, which is this final flourish, what Chopin does in the fourth movement of the B minor sonata is to have what I call a finale section, which is a kind of glorious a fusion. The energy pours forth and so forth, and we work and work towards that kind of thing, and it ends in the most spectacular way with dissonance coming out of every pore.
Most exciting moment in Chopin is the end of the
Yeah, but I have to ask you, there's an interview that Vladimir Horowitz did with our friend David Duvall, where he said, I don't play the B minor sonata because although the first movement is genius, I think the largo is too long. And he said the fourth movement is unpianistic, believe me. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, he had an unusual pianistic approach, so maybe it was unpianistic to him and his particular idiosyncratic technique. We just have a few minutes. I wanted to actually bring, speaking of form, speaking of bel canto, our attention to the first movements, because for me, I mean, tell me if you agree with this, I sense a tension in Chopin, who's writing in this, let's say, Beethovenian genre at the time, it's a struggle between motivic development and form in the Beethovenian manner on the one hand, and on the other, Chopin's love for opera. His need to show these really second theme areas like their bel canto scenes, which we really hear in especially the third sonata. There's a tension between Rossini and Beethoven almost at play here, and it affects his sense of form. And for a long time I was very unsatisfied with the formal unfolding of the third sonata's first movement. I wonder if it took you guys a while to kind of understand what the development was even doing.
Not me. I think it's one of the greatest things he wrote. I think
I'm not
it's
challenging
total
that, but
genius.
was it something that struck you right away, like a ballade or a nocturne might, or did it take you a while to sort of understand what Chopin was doing?
Oh no, because I think it's just this wonderful abundance of counterpoint, and Chopin is just showing off because he was becoming more adept at contrapuntist as he was developing, and this is just Chopin just really, showing off in a marvelous way.
I mean, I think the whole thing you're talking about the development in particular, the third.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really talking here about a different concept of time, musical time. And this is something that Chopin developed over the years, moving away from chronometric time and kind of sectionalized time to something that speaks in its own terms. I think just to add one point about the first movement of this second sonata, everybody plays the main theme so fast, da-da, and so agitated.
Pogorelic did. Oh God, remember that? Yeah.
If it's too fast, you get to the second theme too soon and it kills the film.
Well, speaking of time, unfortunately we're running out of time and we're going to need to get back to the music. So we look forward to hearing more performances of especially the second and third sonata, but also the two performances of the first. Stay with us and thank you for watching the International Chopin Competition. See you in the hall.